Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Ukraine has agreed to a U.S. proposed ceasefire deal, bringing about the resumption of American aid and intelligence. How will the Trump administration get Russia on board with this proposal? Moving to China, which recently held its National People's Congress meeting, we discuss how the country is growing its global leadership by taking advantage of the U.S. withdrawal from the post-World War II liberal order. Finally, we look at the backlash to MAGA among U.S. allies and its effect on their domestic politics.
So it's now been another month under the new administration, and they've been busy, mostly the 5 bullet points. That takes up a lot of your time. How are things going? How are things going being the most hated group in America?
I know. You would think the term civil servant would be more appreciative among the American public, but apparently not. It's mostly unchanged, except for, as you said, we get to write 5 bullet points every week. I should put as one of my bullet points, writing the 5 bullet points. That would, people react in different ways to something that's going to be read by an AI. But since you also have to send it to your supervisor, I think that keeps people from being too cheeky.
Yeah.
Maybe. It's pretty dumb. And I think there's just so much uncertainty overhanging everything. There's always rumors that the Defense Department is going to start laying off probationary workers, but it is yet to do so. And so it's just waiting what's going to happen.
Well, and it seems like there's been such a backlash against the probationary workers from other agencies. So I know the court systems basically said probationary workers from the Department of Energy, they had to rehire those. That's been happening kind of across the board. So maybe that's the reason that they're holding back.
Probably. I mean, that would be a good reason. And I think the uncertainty of having labeled everybody mission critical. In fact, it was kind of interesting that the people who tried to take the fork in the road had their request denied because they are labeling every job as mission critical so that you kind of hopefully don't have probationary employees being let go. But no one knows if that's going to work yet or not.
Yeah, no, it's still big. And then, of course, will the Trump administration listen to the courts? That's the open question. You're having these rulings come out against it, but will they actually follow through?
I mean, that's a big crisis if they don't.
Yeah, for sure. But it seems to be that's what they're pushing for, how far they can go and which particular topic, they're going to try to push the envelope as far as they can.
Some major constitutional problems, though, if that's the approach they take.
Yeah, but if you frame it as national security or the president's prerogative, I mean, it comes down to the Supreme Court and kind of how they would rule on such a matter.
Yeah. And can you imagine having been let go because you're probationary and then being told you're going to be reinstated, knowing that they're probably just going to look for some reason to get rid of you again?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out you're just going to be looking for another job that whole time.
I just spend all 8 hours at work, working on my resume, networks, all that.
Yeah, because none of this is about efficiency. I mean, I think we know that. This is about instilling fear, the federal employees. And as Project 2025 kind of clearly laid out, the goal is to demoralize you guys, to get you to quit, and to fulfill the long-term objectives since the New Deal of disassembling everything around the New Deal and its artifice and the growth of government and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of that to be privatized.
Exactly. Although it's also kind of interesting reading stuff about the IRS, disassembling the IRS by getting rid of a significant amount of employees and how that will actually cost the government up to $1 trillion.
Yeah, of course. There's no better investment than the IRS. I mean, those audits bring in multiples of what they cost in terms of tax cheats.
In more positive news, I had a op-ed published by The Hill on looking at how China is using its foreign assistance programs to increase its global leadership role, and the problem with the U.S. just ceding that role by getting rid of its own aid programs.
Yeah, and it was a really great piece, and you wrote it despite the timing and your position within the federal workforce, so kudos to you on that.
I don't think my supervisors were thrilled.
Which is a little ridiculous, because I think it's a very mild criticism. It's not like you're going with knives out in a partisan
Mm-mm.
manner. And it's very focused on national security and the implications against America's greatest rival in China and its potential to take advantage of these misguided policies. So
It's leading, again, not making my bosses very happy, but leading to a couple meetings with senators. Senator Chris Van Hollen, who I'm meeting with his foreign policy team on Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is the ranking member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So that should be interesting. I mean, these are pretty senior members, and having a discussion about my research, something I look forward to.
yeah, exactly. No, I think it's really awesome. And yeah, congrats on that.
Yeah, thank you. And just navigating the waters of trying to act as a private citizen who works for the federal government is interesting and tricky, but it's something that I just really believe in.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you don't let, if we really do think we're in an environment of rising authoritarianism, then the biggest thing you can do as a citizen is not comply in advance, and separating kind of your role as somebody who works for the Defense Department versus your role as a private citizen and academic researcher, and taking that stance on things that you don't think are right, exercising your First Amendment rights.
Yeah, and mainly I just think people should be aware of the consequences of our action, right? And how it affects our national security. And if we're making these decisions, we must do that wide-eyed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on to our first topic, just kind of as an aside, we had an interesting experience last weekend. We went to a Ukraine rally, and so we got to do our own little part in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, it was a really great event. It took place on the South Ellipse, so right in front of the White House, and featured what was called the largest Ukrainian flag in the world, which I believe. And holding it, we got pretty late in the event, so I think it had been held by a large, several hundred people in a pretty windy environment, but then got to help roll it up too. So that was, but it was a really great, particularly following the absolute shambolic, shameful meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump in the White House the week before. So it was good to let out some of the frustration, to say the least, about the U.S.'s apparent pivot against Ukraine.
Yeah, so one good thing for Ukraine is that there is now a resumption of aid and intelligence sharing due to the fact that Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire proposal by the U.S. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this is a following, again, the White House meeting where it just seemed like there's a real question whether the relationship could be repaired. Zelensky kind of flew back immediately to Europe, had a series of emergency meetings with leaders from the UK, France, and Germany. And fortunately, they were able to patch up things enough. And then between the meeting of the U.S. and Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, where Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, and then their equivalent on the Ukrainian side, met and agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal. And because of that agreement and previous kind of backroom discussions, Ukraine was on board so long as the U.S. reversed its policy, which since March 3rd had frozen all intelligence support for Ukrainian operations and for military aid, which appears to have directly led to losses on the battlefield within the Kursk region.
Yeah, so that was a pretty big deal, I think. Now it seems like the ball is in Putin's court, and it's harder for the U.S., for Trump to portray Ukraine as the obstacle to peace, while it's trying to get Putin to agree to the ceasefire deal that Ukraine has already agreed to.
Yeah, and I think this is where they run fundamentally up that Russia has relatively little motivation for a ceasefire currently, and they equivocated a bit in their response, but it seems clear, I think, from most analysts I've read, is that Russia still very much has maximalist goals. And people are reading that based on Putin's statement, which is very long and rambling, as is typical.
He and Trump have a lot in common then.
Well, yeah, clearly they're best buds. We know this. But it goes back, to why he wants to see the root causes of the crisis addressed. And that involves his old bugaboos about NATO's eastern expansion following the end of the Cold War, wanting to see the end of the Zelensky administration, Ukraine that's effectively disarmed. Obviously, the territorial gains officially recognized in terms of Crimea and the 4 other oblasts. All of this ultimately leading to a Ukraine that is pacified and under Russia's sphere of influence. So, what you can see is that Russia wants to take, on one side wants to take advantage of a very favorable U.S. administration, but at the same time isn't willing to cede much of anything, especially when it feels like it has the advantage currently.
Yeah. So I think Russia's response is certainly not surprising. What will be just interesting is to see how the U.S. navigates this. Does Trump carry out? He has threatened more sanctions on Russia. Will he carry out that threat? Is there anything he can do to twist Putin's arm, and particularly so that he looks like a strong leader who finally ended this war? Does he have any leverage on Russia?
Yeah, and this is where I really question whether he does or not. The threat of additional sanctions that they've placed a couple on, but we've discussed it at length. The sanctions on Russia are already pretty severe. The only thing left to target is directly the energy exports, which obviously Trump would be reluctant to do. He has a goal to get oil at $50 a barrel. That's part of the deal, or part of the interpretation of why OPEC went through with its production increases, despite the fact that the global economy, because of his tariff and trade wars, has weakened considerably. So it seems unlikely. The one area that you could maybe target Russia on, it seems unlikely that Trump would do. And then the other option is to, increase military support for Ukraine, the type of armaments you send. But I also don't see Trump doing that either.
Yeah, and I'm not sure in the end, how much interest Trump has in really keeping Ukraine an independent, sovereign country. Because it sounds like some of these things that Putin wants certainly would mean the end of Ukrainian independence, right? It might still exist as some sort of country, but it would not have any determination over its own, even political affiliation, having to be a Russian under Russia orbit instead of being able to embrace more the economic advantages of being part of Europe.
Yeah, I think it's more would he receive, or would the Republican Party receive any blowback from the obvious defeat of Ukraine? I think it's only the domestic considerations that would be important, because the Ukrainian cause is still popular, amongst Americans. So seeing a defeat, which again, I don't think would happen. It's not going to roll out like Afghanistan where Kiev falls, after we pull support, one, because Europeans are rallying behind and maybe actually finally breaking the glass and hitting the emergency button and making actual substantial change. And then two, the Ukrainian people are fierce. They're not ready necessarily for a ceasefire. And I don't see them rolling over. I think, we talked about this before, that they would go in a much, if their supplies are greatly reduced, they would resort to guerrilla warfare and just intense urban kind of conflicts, of which I don't think Russia could easily overcome. So I think it just becomes a much uglier conflict, a much drawn out, and probably not to the advantage of Russia. It seems like it's better to get some sort of quasi-ceasefire. I think for Russia, their goal is really, can you drag it out long enough? Can you weaken European support so that any sort of peacekeeping force isn't credible? And that whatever you do, you get an election that Zelensky and his kind of successor, that's the other things. They look at what the opposition is for within the Ukraine and kind of pro-Russian contingent. Pro-Russian contingent and polling is, in the low double digits. The person that is running second to Zelensky is the current, I think, defense minister or the former defense minister. So this guy is not some dove on Russia. So it seems it's a difficult path for Russia to get, if it's going to take these maximalist goals, to turn Ukraine into a vassal state without much greater commitment, which obviously Russia's been reluctant to do, as we've seen with pulling in North Korean forces. It never has wanted to increase conscription, so it actually targets the middle class within St. Petersburg and Moscow, and those people actually feel the pain of the conflict. It's a difficult path where Russia gets, even in a very favorable scenario, where it gets everything that it wants. But I think playing out longer actually makes sense for Russia, and hoping that you can weaken now, maybe European will, a permanent break between the US and Europe, things along those lines that kind of maximize the goals of reversing as much as possible the gains that NATO has had since the Cold War.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. And it would seem to make sense if Putin sort of played at negotiation, but really just dragged the whole thing out.
Yeah, because when you really think about it from Russia's perspective, it just seems like you have to get in a position where you've weakened Ukraine enough, you dragged it out long enough that the support for the war and disillusionment around kind of democratic governance is such that you could hope to have an influence operation where some sort of pro-Russian group is elected and takes over. I mean, that seems like the only path, because you're not going to get there militarily. I don't think Russia will support it, and I think Ukrainians have proven themselves too fierce. And the fact that, I was surprised they now produce 40% of their own armaments, so having gone from 0% to 40%. And obviously they're world leaders in drone warfare. I mean, nobody is better equipped or more knowledgeable or more scrappy around autonomous warfare than the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and that's gathered a lot of attention from the U.S. And, it's interesting because I had a Ukrainian student in one of my classes last year. Is just the incorporation of just having a lot of commercial competition, but also their desire to be able to sell those drones outside of Ukraine as well. And I think the one thing it's really shown people is the significance drone warfare can have on a conflict.
Yeah, no, it represents a huge opportunity for Ukraine. It should represent and on its own provide a reason you want Ukraine to remain a sovereign country and on your side, is because I think the U.S. military and definitely the European military can learn a lot from the experience around autonomous warfare that Ukraine has built.
And just from my industry studies on autonomous systems and robotics, that's definitely a heavy interest of the U.S. government, and companies are rushing in to fill that gap and provide the type of drones that the government is interested in. Yeah,
absolutely. So I thought one of the things, taking kind of a step back, that was discussed, particularly around the pivot that the U.S. has apparently made. I think Jon Stewart had the best analogy around professional wrestling, since this is obviously something Trump has participated in the past, and his administration is quite well stocked with WWE former members and leaders, obviously Hulk Hogan as well, during the Republican convention. But yeah, so the U.S. seems to have done something called like the heel turn, which is a common thing within, because for those not familiar, professional wrestling is basically American theater at its best. It's a soap opera.
I don't know about at its best, but it is American theater.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at its best. Now, I haven't watched it since I was a kid, but it's still pretty enjoyable. But yeah, so it's a common storyline that the hero makes what's called a heel turn and then allies with the bad guy. So Jon Stewart kind of made that it's obvious that the U.S. has now made a heel turn, and now apparently has taken up cause with authoritarian regimes, largely driven by if nothing else than Trump's personal preferences towards world leaders that he wants to emulate. And, normally this would be pretty stupid and would require a lot of analysis, but nevertheless, MAGA always has kind of in its back pocket, kind of intellectual framework. And that's kind of fine on one side. They've certainly beefed it up. But then you have people, respected academics. You can argue whether they're respected or not. But then University of Chicago Professor John Mersheimer was featured in an interview in The New Yorker, basically as a water carrier for Trump's foreign policy around Russia. So I was curious, you as an international relations scholar and also as an alum of the University of Chicago, what would you take from that interview?
Well, he didn't say anything that he hasn't said before. Basically, he thinks Russia should be able to dominate its influence over that region. And that means that there is no security guarantee for Ukraine, that Ukraine completely disarms, and that it is definitely not allowed to join NATO or have this. He didn't say the EU, but I presume he would not look favorably on Ukraine having any strong relationship with the EU or become part of the EU. So, basically he argues that Russia, it matters not whether Ukraine would be a threat to Russia if it was part of NATO, but just that Russia thinks it would be a threat to have NATO on its borders, and that a security guarantee for Ukraine would be paramount, would be essentially allowing Ukraine into NATO. It would be the same thing. So one of the things in the article, the interviewee pushed back on, if you have an unarmed Ukraine with no security guarantees, what keeps Russia from just reinvading it later on and taking over the country? And Mersheimer said that it's pretty much a tragedy, but he doesn't think that Russia would do it. Now, he also said in 2014 that he didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine again. But we're supposed to kind of take his word that he's smart enough to know that Russia, just from its intentions, because he also argues that Russia has never shown that it wants to take all of Ukraine, that it's part of some nationalist program, that it's just about making sure it's not part of NATO and not having NATO on its borders, that it's purely from national security and not some imperialistic viewpoint.
Even though Putin's opening to the war was like a 2-hour diatribe about the restoration of the Russian Empire and how Ukraine was so central to the heart of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, for some reason, there are certain things that we're not supposed to take seriously about what Putin says. And then he'll pick out like a sentence or two and say, that's what really reveals Putin's intentions.
Yeah, what I couldn't get over was just like, it goes back to that. Yeah, whatever Putin personally thinks, if he's threatened, then that's a legitimate interest, and that basically the West should roll over. That doesn't matter the sovereignty or the democratic intentions of the Ukrainian people. I think because Putin represents a nuclear armed state, that they should be able to take whatever they want, that there's no point to deterrence, because it would be seen as provocative, and you can't provoke Russia. And basically Russia then has I guess if it wants the restoration of the Soviet Empire, then it should be allowed to have the restoration of the Soviet Empire.
Yeah, what also doesn't take into effect. So the thing that Mersheimer is most well known for is this theory of offensive realism. And basically, this says that countries' actions are defined by their insecurity, by their need for security in the world. So he's definitely defining Russia's actions as based on this is a natural reaction to wanting to increase its security. And because it has the power as a regional hegemon, it should get to flex that power. But he doesn't really respond to then how the rest of the region, how the U.S. and its allies, well, hopefully still allies, feel their own security is threatened, right? So if Russia were to be able to get what it wants in Ukraine, and then nothing is stopping it from getting more influence in these other countries, maybe even take military adventurism in these other countries, whether through some sort of invasion. Now, Mersheimer says that's not going to happen because those other countries are not a threat to Russia. But that's just Russia's perspective. The West has a very valid perspective. If Russia has a perspective that is valid, that potential NATO membership would be a threat to it, then the West and Europe must be equally valid in thinking that Russia is a security threat to it. And why wouldn't they respond in a way that minimized any sort of influence Russia could have? So, I mean, a lot of people think that in his actual public statements on wars, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or even Iraq before, that is not really consistent with his own theories of realism. But it's just notable to have someone with that sort of credibility, I think, defend Putin.
Yeah, no, I think that's the concerning part. How much Putin, and when we say Russia, we mean Putin. I mean, this is an individual dictatorship for all purposes at this point. It's how he's personally threatened and his regime's personally threatened because nobody outside. Well,
Mersheimer's not framing it that way.
That's the because when we say threat, obviously NATO's not a threat. NATO's a defensive organization. It's not going to. Nobody thinks that the Russia motherland is going to be invaded by Ukraine. These are not legitimate threats. The threats are only to his personal rule by having successful, thriving, democratic governments on his border. That's the threat. Now, how is that? I don't know. It's.
According to Mersheimer, it doesn't matter if NATO is a threat. It doesn't matter that NATO is a defensive organization or that there's no reasonable expectation at all or in any form that NATO would attack Russia. But it just matters that, I mean, he's not taking it as Putin's personal regime. He's taking it as Putin representing Russia's security interests. And all that it matters is that he feels
which is his personal. Yeah, I mean, it's wrapped up in him completely at this stage.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Mersheimer is trying to say, oh, Russia's a regional hegemon. It has the right to pursue its interest in
what gives it a right to be a regional hegemon beyond nuclear weapons? Because its economy is less than the size of Italy, where, most of Western Europe, individual countries. I mean, it's a shrinking, declining power. It has no right as a regional hegemon beyond thousands of nuclear weapons, which I guess is enough to...
Mersheimer would argue it's not about whether you have the right to be a hegemon. It's about the reality. Are you a hegemon or not? And because of the nuclear weapons, it is considered a regional hegemon.
Yeah, so what... I guess based on the realist framework, and is he the best representative of the realist framework, you would say? Were there others arguing that the West should pursue kind of a sovereign and free Ukraine?
Well, he's the best representative because he pretty much invented it. He's considered the father of the theory, right? So I think there are definitely academics who are using realist arguments to argue against what Mersheimer is saying, but they are obviously not as well known or considered the founder of the theory itself.
Gotcha. Okay.
So those words do matter to some extent. I mean, how seriously anyone takes academics these days, I don't know, but...
No, but it provides cover. I mean, that's always been kind of the weakness of Trumpism, but it's grown a greater intellectual credibility. I mean, I think Vance is probably a much more forceful, articulate deliverer of kind of MAGA foreign policy. Well, I say that, but he's actually the backlash against him, particularly within Europe, and like his appearance at the Munich conference is pretty legendary at this stage. So I don't know if he's more articulate, but maybe not more diplomatic around the delivery. So yeah, having academic as respected as Mersheimer come out and basically say, yeah, Trump's right on this. He's just a sober-minded realist. And you'll see that framed more and more within the Trump administration. They'll be like, well, we're the grown-ups. We're just looking at this realistic situation. And everything the way that Trump frames is, it's a horrible war. We just want to end. So many millions of people have been killed. We're just looking to end it. And, Ukraine, you don't have the cards. We're just trying to be realist around this. So this framework and then having the father realism just give his stamp of approval. I think you probably underestimate the role that Mersheimer is playing through this act of legitimacy.
You're right. And it's very, very disappointing to see someone with the credibility that Mersheimer has, whether I agree with that theory or not,
I mean,
because I don't, but it's a very influential, I would say the majority of academics do buy into realism, at least in the United States. And yes, it's very disappointing to have someone with that stature then sort of defend Putin and Trump's policy.
I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a University of Chicago academic kind of wrecked some foreign policies. I think was that Chile or no, Argentina back in the 70s. Yeah, I mean, Chicago's got quite the reputation. Yeah,
economics.
Yeah,
it does. Although I wouldn't blame this on University of Chicago, but yeah, its academics do sometimes have outside influence on social policies. So there were a couple stories about China that caught my attention, the most notable one being the annual meeting of the National People's Congress. But first, I wanted to talk briefly about this naval story where a Chinese naval task force in international waters, which happened to be between Australia and New Zealand, engaged in live fire drills. And then since then, the two Chinese warships and the one supply vessel have staged an unprecedented circumnavigation of Australia, fueling political debate about a power that once seemed distant. Quote is from The Economist. So I think what's interesting about this is just the power projection away from its own shores. China showing that for a while, since 2020, China's had the largest navy. It's now bigger than the United States. And this is showing that its naval power is not limited to its own shores, but it too can project power in far away.
Yeah, no, it seems like, because in terms of like overseas bases and things, I mean, it's still just restricted to the one in the Middle East, right?
Mm-hmm, Djibouti.
Yeah. So does it ever do kind of these sort of missions to Djibouti where it's Chinese military vessels? Or is this really the first kind of outside of the South China Sea?
I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the ships that The Economist talks about is that one of them was actually a 10,000-ton cruiser, which China has held as a leap forward in naval modernization. And it may have been accompanied, no one knows for sure, by a nuclear power submarine, which, again, according to The Economist, China for the last 15 years has been trying these out at a rate of nearly one per year, a rate that the U.S. can definitely not match. I don't know if this is the first time outside of the South China Sea, but it is a particularly notable occurrence outside of the South China Sea.
Yeah. And it definitely created concerns within Australia too, had some soul searching in regards to, one, was this the best move, pivot to AUKUS and kind of the agreement with the U.S. under the Biden administration to purchase a certain amount of subs, of which, of course, the U.S. is incapable of manufacturing. We can't meet our own demands, let alone the demands for Australia.
I wouldn't say completely incapable, but not anytime in the near future.
Right. Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm sure and this is, going to be supposedly high up, hopefully, on the Defense Department's areas to improve, has definitely been an area of struggle for the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just a larger problems that we have in our Navy in producing ships and even being able to repair the ships that we have while China is expanding its Navy. And again, of course, there have been lots of incidents in the South China Sea, but that's in China's own neighborhood. And then to be able to project power, navies are very important to international power. And this is a fairly important event in showing that it can project naval power as well.
Yeah, maybe even equivalent to Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet and kind of the sailing. That was like the moment and kind of the announcement, particularly to the UK at the time, which is the dominant naval power, that the US had arrived on the scene.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I don't know if it's that pivotal, but...
Yeah, I don't know either. But it's certainly, I think a lot of powers, with the US's heel turn and betrayal of Ukraine, has powers, particularly within Asia, beginning to question, supposedly this the repositioning and demanding that Europe spend more for its defense is around this pivot to Asia. But then there's the greater question of, is this just about carving up the world into spheres of influence, in which case countries like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, will they have to start making their own independent either alliances with each other or greater reconciliation with China, given this change?
Yeah, and it's definitely affecting domestic politics in Australia, where the moderate has been seen maybe as being too concessionary to China, in the sense that China has restored a lot of its sanctions that it has placed on Australia in 2020, and that trade has resumed. It's overseen that sort of process of reconciling with China and getting that trade restored without taking a soft line on China. But there is, especially in light of these sort of incidents, the opposite party certainly is arguing that it's been too soft on China. Australia has reasons to fear for its own security in a world where the U.S. is less and less present. So moving to the bigger story, which was the annual meeting of National People's Congress, as far as I can tell, China watchers didn't find anything new and surprising in it, but the Atlantic Council did have a few takeaways that some of these I thought were worth discussing. The first one is Xi remains at the apex of his power. That, again, is not surprising. There's been no sign of that weakening in any way. But I thought was interesting their point about there being two Chinese economies and Beijing betting on a stronger horse to pull through. And basically what they're arguing is that China has a lot of economic woes right now. Consumer demand is very low, there's deflationary pressure, and the real estate market hasn't hit a bottom yet. But the one area of the economy that is doing very well, sector of companies, is the tech sector. And this has come to prominence with DeepSeek's AI innovation, but certainly reflects some of major Chinese tech companies more generally seeing strong profits and expansion. So as part of that, you have Jack Ma, who's back now, Jack Ma is Alibaba's founder, and was essentially forced to withdraw from public life in 2020. During that time, she really went after Alibaba, but the tech industry more general, Alibaba paid a huge fine, and a lot of tech leaders were forced to take a much less visible role in Chinese politics. During this period of time, the private sector was known for having a lot of influence over Chinese policies, and that has been shut down under Xi. So there was a big symposium with Xi alongside other tech entrepreneurs, and this was seen sort of as an announcement that sort of tech is back and the government is embracing it. There is now they just started another venture capital fund to encourage companies like DeepSeek. So one thing this might reflect is that Xi feels like the private sector has been sufficiently tamed, or will the need for the tech sector to fuel economic growth kind of give it more of a role again in policymaking? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting pivot. And actually, the Economist had a really good podcast about it, particularly around the unique ecosystem that DeepSeek emerged out of. Because I think a lot of the media portrays DeepSeek, which is the AI platform that came out about a month ago and was able to at least meet the performance of US's champion large language model, ChatGPT, but used far less resources. But this podcast kind of went into the details about Hangzhou, which is a city in China seen as kind of the somewhat equivalent to the Silicon Valley, but it's a really unique ecosystem in the fact that the city leaders there take an approach that's very divorced from kind of what you see, particularly in the northern cities and China, where it's very much state-owned enterprises and kind of top-down. It's more about, that failure is okay. And this is taught in the school systems as well, which is very rare within China, that experimentation, failure's okay, you learn from failures, very Silicon Valley sort of mindset. And that DeepSeek actually emerged not out of some one single dude's genius, but out of this intense competition among various tech firms of thousands that are then kind of whittled down to a couple. So I think that the real question is kind of with the setup of this venture capital fund, can China actually replicate this rather unique model that exists within one of their cities to something bigger to actually challenge the ecosystem that exists within the US? But it's definitely interesting seeing that reconciliation. And then, how much is Beijing and Xi actually willing to give in terms of lower levels of control and openness that are kind of needed for this sector to really thrive?
Yeah, and that's definitely a problem for the U.S., where its advantage has been in, the fail fast, the capital not having top-down control, because it doesn't have the same amount of government funding going into R&D and innovation that is coming from this venture capital world. And there's actually criticism of the venture capitalists who are in China funding some of these Chinese innovation as well, and whether we should curb that in some way. But I mean, if China were to successfully develop that and expand that model, it would be a further technological challenge to the United States. And I think what's really important for people to know is that, I encounter this all the time, that China can't invent things, that China just copies what we do. But China has become very innovative and is truly challenging the U.S. across many sectors, and maybe even slightly advanced in some sectors. And we have to think about our own ecosystem and what is going to allow the U.S. to thrive. Because if we lost innovation in tech and some of these other industries, that would be very problematic to our national security.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the points that the Economist podcast made, and is dear to my heart, is that the one area that the U.S., even if China is able to replicate this system of Silicon Valley kind of on a limited scale, this system of innovation, that the U.S. has the advantage of having a global talent pool to draw upon. I mean, that's always been the U.S.'s greatest advantage as a multicultural, diverse society, that we can draw in the best and brightest from around the world and then have them contribute to our national security and to our prosperity. And that's something that China's cut off from. China has to depend, nobody from outside of China is coming to China. So they're dependent on their local population. I think the idea is also to drain off China's best and brightest if we can. But if you lose that through divisive policies, you have a representative from West Virginia that had recently proposed last week a bill to end all student visas being granted from China, that would take one of the remaining biggest advantages that the U.S. has and taking it and throwing it in the trash. And that's, beyond tragic and would clearly undermine our position in national security.
Another thing, I mean, it's important that we have that advantage because we cannot produce the number of PhDs, the number of engineers, the number of tech people that China's graduating, right? They have a huge advantage in the numbers of people doing STEM in China that we could just never match in this country. And so being able to draw from a more global pool of the top tech talent around the world is crucial for us to maintain any sort of advantage.
Yeah, and I would caveat that with it's only a handful of Chinese universities that are producing truly world-class researchers on par with a lot of our leading public state universities. But nevertheless, I mean, it's an advantage that we can't give up. But I think I wouldn't look necessarily at just the numbers, because a lot of people have done that. But that being said, a lot of people have looked at kind of the quality of the journals and the citations and the number of things that is certainly a precursor to taking leads within these industries. And the entire direction has been in China's direction. So we can't help but think that over time, that's going to lead to these breakthrough innovations. If they can figure out, similar to what Heng Zhao has figured out in the tech sector, kind of that unique ecosystem of public support and flexibility and venture capital kind of funding, combined with a university that has this more open failure as an option, public-private partnership sort of thing going on.
Yeah, I just think that we underestimate the quality of what China is doing. You're right, the quantity itself is maybe not a measure, but quantity matters too. I mean, when you have that many people devoted to STEM, it has some effect, right?
Yeah, and I think the better point is not only kind of around the Chinese students, but just all foreign students. If you took that away from the U.S., it's gone. I mean, and it's not, because our American population is dumber or less motivated. Well, it is less motivated, and it's because of economic incentives. There's no economic incentive for kind of our best and brightest in STEM to pursue a PhD because they can go to Silicon Valley, because they can go, to engineering firms and make the same or more amount of money. We're dependent on foreign students just because of the academic model and system that's set up to, frankly, put in, I won't say like slave-like wages, but put up with grad student stipends and fees for the exchange of having a potential pathway to a work visa and a potential pathway to a green card, to deliver kind of that high-end, highly specialized research. It really pushes the envelope in ways that, an American that is just looking to cash out with a master's isn't going to deliver in a private sector firm.
Yeah. So I think we shouldn't underestimate what China is doing. And definitely this sort of trend is something that we should pay attention to. And we need to make sure that our own policies are supporting what we have an advantage in and that we do what we can to maintain that advantage, right? And I think the policies have to be really geared positively to positive inducements in our own economy, because we've seen, through DeepSeek that preventing exports of these ships and trying to limit China's ability that way is not effective.
I mean, to your point about where China's pulled ahead and where we could actually learn from them is like areas around battery manufacturing, or I know it's way out of favor now, EV manufacturing. I mean, clearly they are far ahead of us in that, and that the best way to learn from them is to allow for joint ventures and technology transfer where Chinese companies set up plants, at least around battery manufacturing, because that's the only way we're going to be able to catch up with them.
Yeah, it was interesting because Scott Kennedy at CSIS was naming like positive things that could come in negotiations between the U.S. and China. And one of them he said could encourage China to set up manufacturing in the United States and transferring that property. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who are more like, was it a senator or a congressman? Yeah. Congressman from West Virginia who see any type of Chinese presence, and particularly investments like that, as threatening to U.S. national security. So I thought that was an interesting comment from Kennedy, and a discussion that should be had. I mean, I personally am on the side with Kennedy that thinking if China had to set up some manufacturing, that would be a good way to transfer some of the IP.
I'd be shocked if China agreed to that.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones like, hey, we know this game. This is the game we play. We're not going to fall for this.
Exactly. So that's the tech sector. The other thing that Atlantic Council noted is, and as well as many other people, but Beijing has seen U.S. President Donald Trump's strongman-style foreign policy with its American first priorities as an opportunity to paint China as a kinder, better partner. So, I mean, you've already seen before this a lot of trends where China is increasing its role in multilateral organizations and foreign assistance programs. At the same time, U.S. is sort of withdrawing from them. But now under Trump, challenging much of the tenets of the liberal order, which was around free trade and political liberties. I mean, obviously, in terms of political liberties, we see that weakening in the U.S., but also definitely not much emphasis on that coming from Trump. But more disturbing is sort of these tariffs, which we talked in depth about, but how that is affecting free trade, and not just the tariff wars with China and Canada of all places and Mexico, but this regime of reciprocal tariffs that is supposed to go into place in April 2nd, which undermines, I mean, that's supposed to be on every country and really undermines the entire system of free trade. This is where the U.S. has certainly led and has certainly benefited a lot from. And with the U.S. withdrawing from that, China can argue that it is more stable in its partnerships, that it is not only out for its own good, but is looking for partnerships that benefit both sides. It's portraying itself as not ideological, but pragmatic, which is very popular in the global South, and is managing. I mean, this story is helping China project power, even as, there are other things that you would think that would go against it, such as it being the largest debt holder and facing criticisms over the quality, environmental, labor impact of its projects. And it matters. We kind of talked about this in the last episode too, but China being able to take increasing global leadership has real national security implications. Maybe less extent, but important is the way it is reshaping the UN to better meet its own priorities and de-emphasizing human rights. There are a lot of spillovers with PLA meetings in these places, particularly Africa. So China may only have a base in Djibouti, but it has all kinds of military cooperation with countries across Africa, and its control of critical infrastructure such as ports. So it also goes to the fact that the U.S. lectures other countries about the dangers of taking Chinese money for these infrastructure projects. And in general, its partnerships with China, we lecture them on that while not offering anything in return. And now it's even worse because we are not only offering nothing in return, but we are being a much worse partner in navigating reciprocal tariffs and putting all kinds of other economic negatives into those relationships.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I think it represents a great opportunity for China. I mean, obviously, countries within the global South will approach it with some cynicism, but I think I'm particularly interested on the softer aspects because, China's aid, as we talked about last time, is often tied to infrastructure or these other goals. But will China then step in where the U.S. has withdrawn aid regarding food aid, regarding vaccinations, regarding all these health initiatives? Will they be smart enough and adept enough to, replace kind of these things that were still done in U.S. national interest? I mean, a lot of it to help prevent future pandemics from breaking out and keeping them contained. Well, do you see China stepping into that a little bit softer portion that the U.S. is ceding?
It seems to have started to make commitments to do so, whether it will in any large scale. So, like I mentioned in my article for The Hill, that Colombia, I believe Myanmar, and some other country had already been contacted that China would fill in those aid programs that were being discontinued by the United States.
Yeah, because the discontinuation of, for instance, the AIDS program that was set up by George W. Bush, probably one of his biggest accomplishments, could devastate hundreds of thousands of lives within Africa. So it seems like this great soft power opportunity for the Chinese to step in.
Yeah, and I think China thinking in a larger context of what it means to be a global leader. Oh, so sorry. So I was just looking it up. The foreign aid programs that China has made commitments to or offered was Nepal, not Burma. Nepal, the Cook Islands, and Colombia. And in that Australia story, it mentions too, like the importance of like the Cook Islands being close to Australia. Yeah. So these are also very strategically important places. Yeah. So to go back to what we were talking about, what exactly does Chinese global leadership mean writ large, beyond economic partnerships? I think we're still a little uncertain about that. So it is still important, however, that they are getting this opportunity, that we are handing over this opportunity. Yeah. And economic relationships have a lot of spillover, as I said, to military partnerships and to other areas of leadership that directly threaten U.S. interests. Going briefly to the tariffs are such a bad idea, right? We're watching our own economy slip into recession. One man has managed the entire global economy to decrease. This one man in just a matter of a couple of months. Reciprocal tariffs would be so harmful across the board to both the U.S. and global countries that it's just so frustrating and unthinkable that this could be happening and that we could be withdrawing so completely from the liberal order which free trade was a very prominent part of. And of course, pure free trade, there were problems with that, right? Well, it wasn't ever pure free trade, but there were certainly problems the way it's been executed. But this response is extraordinarily harmful to both the U.S. and the global.
Do you think markets are underestimating the impact? Because I think I had forgotten, even though we talked about it last night, I think I had forgotten the timing of these reciprocal tariffs and just how broad they are. Because it is basically, I can't remember, were there any limits to it? But it's basically if any country has a particular tariff on a single American good, that we would match that equivalent on their side. So it's, thousands of items across thousands of different relationships. It's extremely complex. Is the market kind of, because you had talked about this before and you're like, well, the market's not taking this seriously. And indeed it wasn't. It doesn't think that now, but I don't think it fully understands reciprocal tariffs either. But it basically looked at the first Trump administration and said, this is all bluster. This is all negotiation tactics. He's not actually going to do it when the market drops. And what have we seen over these past 3 weeks? We've seen the market tailspin and one of the most rapid declines in the market's history, from a peak to now in correction territory. So S&P down 10%. And the response from Trump directly and from his various agents, including the Treasury Secretary and some of his campaign staff, is that don't worry about it. This is a small transition. There's going to be great things. We're going to bring back manufacturing, and basically calling anybody worried about the stock market drop a bunch of bedwetters.
It's not going to just be the stock market drop. That's just now the kind of early indication. I mean, having steel and aluminum tariffs climb up to 25% from Canada is harming numerous businesses, including our car industry. And
well, yeah, but the stock market's a forward projection of how that's going to impact those businesses. So it's saying this is going to be bad.
Right. So I guess my point is it's not just about your money in the stock market, your 401k that's going down.
I mean, it's a reflection of future cash flows.
Right. That the entire economy is going to be harmed. Right.
Yeah.
In a substantial way. And I don't think they're accounting yet for reciprocal tariffs. I think it's really hard to imagine what that's going to look like.
Yeah, probably because they don't know. I don't even know how you would go about doing it. No, it's a complex system, and
it's supposed to go into effect April 2nd, and I honestly have just no idea how it's going to be implemented. So I definitely think the stock market isn't taking that into account.
Everybody puts on the market April 2nd. It's dropping a lot further.
If they go ahead with this, and harming the global economy also harms the U.S. economy. It's just a lose-lose proposition. And there's no evidence of tariffs bringing back manufacturing. And even if it did, it would take years to see those gains.
It's hard to even fathom, because you're right. Yeah, even if you did imagine the best case scenario where, okay, it's going to bring back, it's going to take way beyond, his administration to see any of these potential benefits for the middle class. And as I recall, the American people are like super patient in regards to economic suffering.
Yeah. So, I mean, if he doesn't start walking back his tariff policy, I mean, a lot of people think we're headed to a recession, which will cause significant harm to a lot of people.
And it's also just the instability. I mean, I had to, when I was researching the Canadian situation, we'll talk about shortly, I wasn't sure what was on and what was off in the tariffs, because it's just been back and forth, and then 30-day briefs, and then just one thing after another, and it's just chaos. Nobody knows what. Even if he just stuck with it, that would have probably been better than this on and off sort of insanity. I think
the market would still react more negatively because you would see the economic harm more clearly.
Well, yeah, but it didn't believe him when he took it off either, because it was like...
Yeah, but it didn't take all tariffs off. There's still the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Yeah, you still have the steel and aluminum, just not the blanket 25% on all Canadian goods. Right. So
definitely certain sectors are still being targeted, and most people think this is not enough to really grow the American steel industry, which is definitely... It
wasn't last time. It hardly created any jobs. Yeah.
Really struggling. So just really bad policy, just fascinating how much, in a negative way, negatively fascinating how much harm a person can do to the economy in such a quick amount of time.
Yeah, because you're talking about before. I mean, the president, it doesn't have, in normal cases, shouldn't have much influence on the economy. But yeah, if you're like just setting out to destroy it, apparently he can have a lot of influence, a single guy.
And I think the scary thing is that what Trump's fundamental beliefs are, like 90% of economists can tell him all the reasons why tariffs are bad and going to harm the economy. But his fundamental belief system is that tariffs are good.
Yeah, which is very, I mean, I thought this is interesting, but the point is, I mean, he's held this for decades. He's held this since the 80s. And of course, his worldview in a lot of ways is frozen since the 80s. I'm still surprised he's not just targeting Japan and Germany on some of these. I don't know why the Canada thing, on the deal he negotiated last time.
No one understands Canada. It's not a major source of fentanyl. There's just no reason for it. It makes no sense whatsoever.
It's all hard to wrap your head around, other than it's enormously destructive.
Yes. So speaking of Canada, I think that brings us to this final section that you want to talk about more generally about the backlash to MAGA's policies, its global agenda, and how it is affecting domestic politics in these countries.
Yeah, boy. We've discussed before, especially in talking about Steve Bannon and kind of the greater MAGA project. Because this isn't just limited to making America great. They want to make all far right-wing parties and a certain form of nationalist conservatism prominent again throughout the globe. So part of this global project is supporting parties that they feel are favorable to the MAGA agenda, kind of in their own ways. And what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, particularly driven by the negative effects of the trade war and within Europe, the betrayal of Ukraine, is this growing backlash. And I think that the beating heart of this backlash globally is our good friends to the north and Canada, which again, we've talked about how dumbfounding the targeting of Canadians are. But I think the number one thing, in reading forums, reading articles, is that Canadians are legitimately and fully pissed off about this. And it's not even about the trade war.
Right. It's not just the tariffs.
Yeah.
It's that he won't stop talking about them as the 51st state. He had another speech this week where he mentioned them as the 51st state.
Yeah. So this part, more than anything, because obviously, we talked about the economic effect hasn't really hit yet because it's been on and off and then off again. But this just level of disrespect and disdain and threatening of annexing Canada has really unlocked, because again, I've interacted with many Canadians, and I will say they live up to the stereotype of being some of the friendliest people like on the planet. I mean, legitimately are extremely friendly people. This has unlocked a rage and righteous patriotism within them that has led to this stunning turnaround within Canadian domestic politics. Because I think, as we talked about during the Biden administration, our neighbors to the north, Trudeau and the Labour Party, had been governing there for like over a decade. And because they essentially are kind of the bag holders of COVID and of inflation and everything kind of around that, we're extremely unpopular. And we're trailing in national polls by the Conservative Party by a good 20 points before kind of the Trump administration came in. But because single-handedly, because of Trump and because of his rhetoric around annexing Canada, that the Labour Party has seen a gigantic surge, and they are now running in a dead heat in polls, which is absolutely shocking. To go from like completely dead in the water to this point where they could well elect as their new prime minister, Mark Carney, who took over for Trudeau. Trudeau stepped down. Mark Carney came in. He's not a charismatic figure. He's like an ex-banker. He's very similar kind of background as Macron, coming from finance, but way less charisma. But nevertheless, because the Labour Party is now seen as the defenders of Canadian patriotism, and the Conservative Party had made such a huge bet on their main leader, Pierre Poilievre, quote me on that pronunciation, has been so tied to MAGA that it's now become a detriment. And it could very well that labor in this snap election that everybody thinks that Mark Carney will call shortly, that they'll actually be the difference. So it's just stunning. You'll see, like, there's a Vox article that's basically talking about just how infuriated Canadian consumers are. And you'll see pictures within Canadian stores, and they've specifically kind of marked out U.S. products or
said, don't buy this, it's American.
Yeah.
Like labels all over supermarkets.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a complete unification, even across party lines, because probably the biggest criticizer of the whole movement is Doug Ford, who's a conservative member. He's like the equivalent of the governor of Ontario. And even though in some ways he may sympathize with MAGA, greater is his Canadian patriotism. So he was the one that
Ontario being greatly affected by tariffs.
Yeah. So again, defending their economic interest as well. And he's the one who threatened to cut off energy supplies from the U.S., and that's what led to a tit and tat and then eventually a de-escalation.
But he wanted to raise the prices by 25%.
So not full cutoff.
No.
Although maybe in his rhetoric, he was certainly getting fired up.
So he placed temporarily a 25% tariff on electricity going to the U.S., where then Donald Trump increased tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%. And so then they decided to get rid of the energy tariffs in exchange for Trump going back to the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Okay.
So yeah, Mark Carney may not be charismatic, but I saw a little bit of his speech when he became prime minister, and it was very impassioned when he started talking about the U.S. and Trump.
Yeah, so I think you're seeing new life. So we kind of talked about Canada, but also within Europe as well. I think the response and kind of the realization that U.S. may not be a reliable partner at all going forward. Even if Trump goes away in 4 years, what guarantee that a Trumpified Republican Party may not continue to hold these views of skepticism around the Atlantic relationship and around NATO? So you're seeing European leaders kind of respond and step up. And I think probably the biggest indication of actual material change has been in Germany, where the incoming chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has come out and been able to navigate around Germany's famous or infamous debt limit. So it could never exceed like a 3% debt limit, but has now had this carve out for defense and infrastructure. I think the other things that you're seeing is that kind of along these lines that the EU is also trying to set up a fund of 150 billion euros that would provide cheap loans to countries that want to, rebuild, for rearmament. And also allowing these countries, if it is used for the purposes of rearmament, that it can exceed kind of the bloc's agreements on the normal fiscal restraints around deficit spending.
Talk about what should threaten Russia or feel threatened, right? Like also this backlash, like if you have Europe rearming, that's more of a threat to Russian security.
All of this is backfiring on them. They were against NATO expansion. You had Scandinavia, you had Finland and Sweden join NATO. You have NATO forces being redeployed kind of to Poland. So further, everything that they're doing is against their interests. So yeah, to see Germany, of all countries, for Russia to rearm, seems like a strategic disaster if they follow through with this. I think the other interesting thing is seeing Macron sort of validated, because he had always had this more Gaullist approach that the United States is not dependable. EU needs its own foreign policy and army in order to be an independent actor on the global stage. And now you have this opportunity. Now, mind you, Macron is in a weakened state. They barely kind of kept their government together, and they certainly face a challenging election in 2027. But you do have this alignment again, because that's what was missing, was kind of this German-French alignment to really drive leadership. But now you have this approach, and Germany's always been very pro-Atlanticist. But now kind of this recognition that, no, we can't depend on the US anymore. That combined with Ken Starmer in the UK, who now, probably the UK has had its, since Brexit, probably its closest relationship with the EU, also increasing defense spending. So it's just cited this backlash against MAGA in this way domestically, which could, in the long term, be good, at least for the cause of liberal democracy, having another power center, but certainly something that the U.S. has discouraged for a long time until probably very recently.
Yeah, I've been concerned about the EU becoming a hegemon, a regional hegemon, or some sort of major power, because we wanted to be the sole superpower. And everything about our current foreign policy is like, oh, let's not be the superpower anymore, which has tremendous implications on our security.
Yeah.
One thing that is also interesting about this is that France said it would extend its own nuclear deterrence umbrella over Europe. But in general, South Korea has wanted its own nuclear weapons for a while, feeling that the U.S. is not a dependent partner, the feeling that Japan may want its own nuclear weapons, the fact that Germany may want its own nuclear weapons. There's a lot of concern. This will cause a lot of nuclear proliferation, which is dangerous. I mean, the more, as my friends who study it have pointed out to me, the more nuclear weapons there are, purely the greater chance of something gets used, right? And so it's definitely something we don't want to see, and yet Trump's policy is directly encouraging it.
Yeah, no, the nuclear proliferation aspect, very concerning, but who could blame it? I mean, that's half the reason that the Ukraine is in its situation, is giving up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange for, obviously not hard security guarantees, but some sort of soft security guarantees with Russia at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So the other things, I guess, you've seen domestically, obviously, Europe's kind of had this rallying, and obviously, we've seen it before around Ukraine. Words don't necessarily lead to firm action, so there's going to have to be a lot of follow-up to see a lot of these proposals come to fruition. But you're certainly seeing a weakening of the far-right groups domestically within kind of these key nations. The AfD, we talked about last time, it was directly supported by Elon Musk in the election. And despite really perfect conditions, the AfD really failed to gain votes outside of its stronghold in Eastern Germany. And the other thing you've seen is people kind of rally around, again, kind of on the consumer. What can consumers do to protest against this rising authoritarianism? And Tesla is being targeted, particularly in Europe. I mean, in the US as well, but European sales of Tesla have plummeted to the point where the company's viability is certainly challenged globally between that and the and Chinese EV sales within the global South. So I think, something like 90% fewer sales, following this, because it's now seen as the neo-Nazi car.
Mm-hmm.
So why do Germans want to buy that? At the same time, on the UK, the Reform Party, which is formed by Nigel Farage, who is, best buddies with Trump, he was at the inauguration, has fully supported him the whole time. Reform Party has a very small presence within Parliament with only 6 members. But nevertheless, they managed to get in a fight with Musk on X, who has taken an interest in the Reform Party and thinks they can grow it into something that can challenge Labour and the Tories and kind of do the same thing that MAGA has done within the UK. But even Farage has kind of fallen out with Musk, saying he doesn't have what it takes, because Farage is trying to distance himself because he knows kind of how unpopular the heel turn against Ukraine is within the UK. That's just something that they can't sell domestically. And then at the same time, even though the election is in 2027 on the French side, Marine Le Pen is having to distance herself around this backstabbing of Ukraine, because that is very much, supported within the French electorate. So it just seems like the stuff that sells domestically here from MAGA is absolutely toxic when it's brought abroad, especially in such a forceful, undiplomatic way that both Elon Musk and JD Vance have done over the past month.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting to see this impact. I mean, I'm kind of encouraged almost to see. I mean, it's definitely a good thing that these far-right parties are weakening and that their association with Trump is definitely something that's hurting them. So it's encouraging to see backlash in other countries, even if we are limited in what we can do in the United States to prevent the harm of these policies.
Yeah, I think you have to look for, looking ahead to like 2026, what things, obviously the Canadian election, that'll be before we didn't talk about, but you have a big Hungarian election in 2026. There was a great article in the Times of London that talked about a former Fidesz, so Hungary's dominant party, Orban's party member that has left the party and is now represents a major challenge. And if you believe the polls, is actually leading currently, but is going to face, major uphill. But these are the sort of things, if you could take down Orban in Hungary, which would be extraordinary because it has a much outsized influence. It's probably the greatest thing that the far right within MAGA looks at as like the model that it wants to bring to the U.S. in terms of autocracy. So if you could take that down and then have a successful midterm in 2026 for the U.S. where the Democrats take control of at least the House, that could be a major turning point in trying to roll back the extremely destructive forces that MAGA has unleashed and unfortunately will continue to unleash with very limited pushback, for at least the next year.
And it's amazing what has happened in 3 months and what can happen more in a year. But anyway, it's encouraging, like you said, to see this pushback against far-right parties and what is happening in Europe. And it's at the point, where somebody has to stand for the liberal order. And if Europe could only get its act together, and like you mentioned, but I think people underestimate how Germany and France getting on the same page is the most crucial element of this, because it's been the fact that they have not been on the same page that's really kept the European Union from growing as a foreign policy, its own foreign policy, and as more of a power. So if they truly get on the same page and they stay there, then that bodes well for Europe developing greater unity and a greater presence on the global stage.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think one of the encouraging things to see out of this last EU meeting is this idea of having more flexible core groups again, where it's these groups of the willing that want to have the greater integration, for instance, on like foreign policy or defense policy, to be open to that. So you could kind of have this, similar to how the Union was built around kind of these core groups. But yeah, I mean, Germany and France are the beating heart of the EU project. So if they can kind of form around the Netherlands and then around the UK as well, particularly if the UK begins to push towards some sort of re-entry into the EU, then that kind of core group of countries, I think, could be a pretty powerful force.
I think they have potential for power even without the UK. But if you had France, Germany, and the UK all in the same space, all on the same board, then you truly have a chance of having Europe be another global power. Then we'd see what a really multipolar world looks like, with the US and China and the EU all having significant influence without one necessarily being as dominant.
I still hold out hope that the U.S. will return to sanity, in which case, two powerful blocks that essentially represent the liberal world order, I think, can be overwhelming to the opposition.
But I think for a long time, the U.S. did not want a challenge from Europe to its...
I know, that's when we were more into military adventurism in places like Iraq. And
so I like you said, I think now because of the way we're withdrawing, we certainly need a Europe that's stronger.
Yeah, at least half the country thinks maybe that. I don't know about the other country. I mean, I think that's what was so clear from J.D. Vance, particularly around his dismissal of like security forces, European, even though this is like part of the plan he's pushing, was so dismissive of the UK and France and its military capabilities. I mean, to the point of just, one, forgetting about their contributions in Afghanistan and Iraq, or at least for France, I think in Afghanistan, not Iraq.
Oh, they weren't part
famously.
of? Oh, okay.
France famously not part of Iraq, hence the Freedom Fries. But yeah, I think it's just so dismissive of Europe that it has this opportunity that lies there. I think it could be a great economic stimulus to them as well. I mean, I think this sort of Keynesian spending,
defense spending
could maybe get them out of the doldrums that they've been in as well.
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot of down order effects that could be beneficial for Europe. So, I mean, some people, as I had Dan Hamilton, people remember in a previous episode, that really argued how much we need a Europe that will step up and take control over some of its own security issues. I think definitely Donald Trump is an impetus for that. And we're seeing for the first time, really ever, Europe really make moves in that direction instead of just talk.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a little bit, obviously, with the Ukraine. You saw a little bit of it, and Germany certainly did step up its spending. They certainly provided a lot of aid. But yeah, in terms of the really fundamental reforms that they have to make. Now, I mean, I think The Economist makes a good point. How are the people going to react when they realize they have to pay for it? And what sort of trade-offs between guns and butter are they willing to make? And I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. But certainly more deficit spending.
Right.
More debt spending is a good start.
They can do it the way the U.S. does.
You can when you're the global reserve currency. Well, maybe Euro would become more of a stable place for people to put their money. I don't know. They're still overcoming all the Euro crises. It was never able quite to challenge the dollar, but I don't know. Right now, the yen is seen as like the real source of stability. And they have like friggin' 300% debt running in Japan. So I don't really understand some of the monetary finances and how that works. But I think it's a promising start. Obviously, a lot for Europe to have to follow through on. And then it's a union made up of 27 different nations. I think getting the agreement among the big core group nations is big enough of a first step. But if they can get that, then you can keep the beating heart of the Enlightenment still alive if the U.S. is going to give up on it.
Agreed. Well, I think this brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for all the articles we discussed in this episode.
Thanks.
Bye.